first off.
You.
Me. All right.
I mean, you.
I think, I personally think that from when Marshall took office to when he died, overall there was an increase in the strength of the Constitution, and my definition of the strength of it is its ability to be enforced, which might not be everyone's definition of strength of the document, but so we can talk about that. But and I think that overall the strength went up because although in Barron v. Baltimore the Bill of Rights was like restricted only to the federal government, just the action of giving judicial review to the Supreme Court already strengthened the enforcement level of the Constitution, and that in itself is enough for it to be strengthened during the Marshall Court. However, I think that if you look within the Marshall Court, it's like strengthened more at the beginning and then like kind of
Slow down.
yeah
I get it.
decreased later in his term.
So I completely agree with Doug. When I was looking at this question originally, I really didn't want to have that opinion. For some, I don't know what I hold against Marshall, but it's something. And the thing that really stuck out to me was yesterday I was reading the packet that you guys got Tuesday when I was out, and it talked about how Marshall really felt the need for a unanimous court. And to me, that really showed strength and power because it showed that they were united and in agreement as opposed to, in constant opposition of each other. So I agree. I think that overall, the Marshall Court has strengthened the what's the word I'm looking for? The enforcement of the Constitution.
But there's another part other than the enforcement is only half of it.
The other part
You got
is the state sovereignty.
Oh, right.
Well, how much the Constitution matters in its enforcement. Which,
Matters to who?
People,
whether the words
states,
of the Constitution, yeah, well, to like whoever it's being enforced against, which you could say that Marshall, like, he really like loosens, uses the language in the Constitution very liberally in a lot of his rulings, which kind of sets a precedent of not really being strict to the Constitution. So the Constitution, so you can enforce the Constitution very well with the judicial review, but now it doesn't really matter that you're actually enforcing the Constitution. So you're just enforcing whatever you want the Constitution to be.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, I agree that something is being strengthened, and I agree that Marshall is almost giving more powers to the law, I guess. But I think that what's actually being strengthened is not the Constitution itself, but actually the federal government, because I think that by like what Yvonne was saying, when they're kind of diluting the powers of the Constitution and focusing on the implied powers and focusing on the necessary and proper elastic clause, they're really expanding the Constitution in a way that takes away from more of a, not necessarily a literal interpretation of it, but it just takes away some of the power of it by saying that we could do almost anything we want to build on our own power by just using the Constitution.
I think that adds a lot to the citizens' power. Like it makes for more room for people to just interpret it how they want. Like I think it strengthens, like you were saying, the government aspect of it, in addition to how the public can use it.
I understand that too, but I think that in a way, if something's allowed to be interpreted, then it's also, it like really just depends on how strict of the interpretation is for it to really be strengthening the Constitution. Because I mean, if somebody says, you look at the text and then you really flip it and you make it something completely different than what it's actually saying, then does that really strengthen the Constitution rather than just strengthen somebody's own opinion?
Well, in this case, it does for the time being.
I mean, yeah, obviously,
Yeah.
obviously, but I'm saying like when it comes down to it, the Constitution itself is
Can-
the thing that's actually being strengthened.
Right.
Can you explain that? What do you mean by it does
Me?
for the time being? Yeah.
Oh.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that all of Marshall's ideals for the for his like court system about everyone being unanimous, everyone being in agreement, like regardless of how accurate the reading is, the intention it held when it was first created, like whatever you're reading in the Constitution, the fact that all of these people unanimously are going to be either in agreement with how someone read it or in disagreement, it's all the same. So it's like if there was somebody who someone said that there was a wrongdoing to him because they misread like something in the 14th Amendment, and Marshall and his entire court basically said, actually, we disagree, but since they all disagree, they all disagree. Because if somebody was in agreement and like two people were in disagreement, then the person who was in the court, like who had this wrongdoing happen to him, would be like, well, there are some people in agreement with me, there are some people in disagreement with me, so I guess I'm kind of right.
So is that strengthening the
Yeah.
court? Is that strengthening the Constitution?
Oh, totally the court. But I think
So
that it has
if
the
it
potential
strengthens
to
the
do both.
court,
But
isn't
it has the potential to do both.
I feel like if you strengthen the court, then you're strengthening the court's power over the Constitution.
I think-
But it's not the Constitution itself that's being strengthened.
Well, I think what we're getting at is what does strengthening a piece of parchment with words on it mean? We're not physically strengthening. Is it paper, parchment?
I don't know if it's paper.
It doesn't
It's actually
matter.
picture.
It is. You're not strengthening the document. You're not strengthening the physical document. That's not what we're talking about. We're strengthening or weakening that we're talking about is the symbolic significance, and I think, or its significance its tangible significance in the lives of Americans. And I think that we can kind of divide the way the Constitution affects our lives into kind of 3 aspects, maybe 4, of like, 1, enforcement, which I think is what Zoe was getting at with like, the court is the enforcement to a certain extent, and maybe he's strengthening that. Then there's like the explicit powers within the Constitution, and like the specific words, and maybe under Marshall, the specific words matter, or like the explicitly stated powers matter less than they did before, and then that's weakening that aspect. But then he's also strengthening the implied powers. So there could be aspects where he's weakening and aspects where he's strengthening.
I see that, but at least for me, how I interpret strengthening the Constitution means like sticking to it and abiding by it. And I'm not saying I agree with creating implied powers, because I mean you talked about this earlier, that with I think it was with the Navy, I don't know, something where like how are they supposed to know that we have airplanes now? Like they couldn't say it wasn't with the Navy, it was with the Air Force. But like how are they supposed to know that now we have airplanes? They couldn't obviously write about that in the Constitution. But I think that from what we've seen, they keep stretching and stretching the Constitution to make it cover whatever they want sometimes. And yesterday in the seminar, they were talking about how at some point you do hit a wall and you can't create a power that is, it may say like no, that like the Constitution specifically says no, you can't do that. But at the same time, by stretching it, you're diluting it and you're making it seem like it's less significant.
So the objection.
Explain.
So the thing about stretching the Constitution, as time goes on, technology evolves, people evolve, the needs of people evolve. Like you said, airplanes. Like the central laws of our country need to evolve to our society. And I understand how that could dilute the Constitution, but it's it's only, it's necessary, it's,
So
like,
means that-
without
That
it,
doesn't, I mean, it could be necessary, I mean, that could,
without it, like, it would,
but that could still mean that the Constitution is being weakened.
It means that the document
I
itself
mean,
matters. Sorry.
no,
That means that the document itself matters less and less, and what matters more and more is the court's interpretation of the document.
yeah.
You could see that as equivalent. The interpretation of the document is the document, in which case it's strengthening it. Well, it might be strengthening it.
Probably.
Think about it like
Because
the rabbinic texts, I mean,
Well,
how the rabbis interpreted it is really how we,
Right, and when we take now we get all of our laws from the rabbinic texts
Okay.
instead of the Torah,
Is that
so
weaken
does
the
that
Torah?
undermine the Torah's significance?
no,
But we don't follow the rules of the Torah, we follow the rules of like the Talmud and the Tanakh and the Tosha, like, all of those things are what we actually follow. We can still have, the Torah is still very symbolic to the Jewish people, and it's still something that's of like utmost significance, but it doesn't mean we follow it.
now we're at like a standstill,
Do you guys think we can maybe
checkmate.
find an agreeable definition of what it means to strengthen the Constitution between all of us, or try to at least come up with something?
Sure.
Because I feel like we're all on different pages, so it's hard to like,
I'm on page 4.
So what do you think?
what do I think? I think that in order for something to be strengthened in the Constitution, then it has to be actually, their interpretation has to be more a strict interpretation of the Constitution. It can't be anything loose. If it's loose, I think it's weakening the Constitution because it's not actually like really getting to what the Constitution is really saying. So I think it has to be a strict interpretation of the Constitution in order for it to actually be strengthened in the Constitution. When it comes to cases and deciding what's constitutional, what's not constitutional.
Which Marshall didn't do.
Yes. So I'm kind of leaning more towards he's weakening the Constitution, Marshall Court. But I can see why judicial review would strengthen the Constitution. It just honestly depends on the scenario.
Well, we also have to try to figure out how we're going to differentiate, if we're like trying to figure out a definition for strengthening the Constitution, what's the difference in strengthening the Constitution and strengthening the courts?
Sure.
Can I ask? I don't want to jump in. I'm really curious as to how people would answer this question. I think that, Zoe, you were getting at that. If you're going to say, and I don't know what you were coming down on, but I think what you were saying, if you're going to say that the purpose of the Constitution is to create a strong federal government, then bravo, John Marshall, you did that. You strengthened the Constitution. But if the purpose of the Constitution is to do something else, he may not have done that. Do I understand?
I wasn't really thinking about it that way, but I see that point of view. I mean, I was thinking of it more. Yeah. I don't know how.
So I didn't want to put words in your mouth, but I am okay. All right,
Sorry.
Wait,
You're having a great seminar. I don't know why I interjected.
I mean, why don't
Stupid
we
me.
explore that question then?
What?
So I said, why don't we explore that middle question? What do you guys think is the purpose of the Constitution?
I really
That what?
The
She's talking
grocery
about-
store. I thought he was talking about the grocery
Oh
store.
yeah. We're not there yet. You keep going. You might get there. You're actually not so far away. But keep.
Ow!
Go ahead, Ethan. You want to know what? Ethan, what do you think? What do you think the purpose of the Constitution is?
I've always kind of thought the Constitution is just like a foundation or a basis for like law. So I mean, all laws should abide by the Constitution. Obviously, I mean, but then there's like also the idea of like can't like they have to be stretched a little bit. So I don't really know, to be honest. Something that people can help me figure
In the,
out.
in the historical context, why was the Constitution created? Like it was after the Articles of Confederation, right? And those weren't strong enough, and then there was the Shays Rebellion, is that what it was?
Yeah.
It was to set a standard for,
It was to what?
it was to set a standard set of laws for the entire nation to follow. With like, what?
Well, maybe it's abstract purpose, but I think Stav's asking about the historical purpose.
Historically, like what if we
It was
like
to
why
strengthen. It was to strengthen the federal government, or
militarily though?
no, its power was probably over the states. That's what I think based on, like, compared to the Articles of Confederation, which, for a number of reasons, I don't exactly remember, was including having to do with the fact that the federal government wasn't strong enough.
It was very weak.
Problem.
It didn't have a centralized military, I don't think.
Does anyone else know more? Why do you ask?
But, yeah,
No,
but-
I'm thinking if we're getting at this question of what is the purpose of the Constitution, why don't we answer that by going back and thinking why was it made in the first place?
Well, it was made to create, like you said, to create a stronger document, like something that would hold together the states stronger than the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
Solve
So
problems.
did Marshall strengthen that purpose?
Well, then, so that's like, I feel like that's the overarching purpose, but then there's different ways of achieving it
Mm-hmm.
that we have to consider. Like there's like Ethan said, there's paying closer attention to the wording and to like making sure that you're not interpreting it loosely. And then there's also just like the symbolism of like using that as a basis for creating a government, like creating a strong government, and just having the Constitution be more symbolic.
I think though that I think some, not necessarily a consensus, but I think that there are a lot of people who are starting to say that a loose interpretation of the Constitution, it makes the Constitution weaker. And I see why, like with maybe the Obamacare example, which is like obviously farther in the future, but like this Marshall kind of enabled that. Like in that kind of situation, like you could make the argument that this is weakening the Constitution, but in the situation of like the post offices, nowhere does it say that the federal government can pay the salaries of post office workers and hire them to work at the post offices that the Constitution allows them to build. So I'm wondering, would having an overly strict reading of the Constitution actually weaken the Constitution?
Oh, by
Would it weaken
by
the
if
Constitution or would it weaken the government?
the Constitution, because if I think it would delegitimize the Constitution to a certain extent, because if I'm a normal American and I want to get my mail and my government or my state just agreed to enter into a binding document with all the other states that form a government under a constitution, and the Constitution allowed the government to build post roads to get me my mail, but not to hire post office workers to actually do the work, I'd be kind of frustrated that I'm not getting my mail, and I'd be like, what's wrong with this Constitution?
Yeah, I disagree, and I would think that, and maybe it's just like I have a different point of view, but I would think that if like the courts or Congress creates laws like that don't, or maybe not so much with the mail, but like with Obamacare that don't, and like, again, I think that weakening or strengthening the Constitution isn't necessarily a good or bad. Like, it's not necessarily bad if the Constitution is weakened, but I think that I would see the Constitution as being delegitimized if these laws or like, I don't know, some like laws are passed that don't really have to do, like that are hanging by a thread based on the interpretations of the Constitution.
I think Stav is bringing another possible interpretation of what it means to strengthen the Constitution. It is to strengthen the Constitution sort of in the eyes of the people, whether the people find it a helpful, a good document, or something that like that creates a well-designed government, or allows for.
So if the purpose of the Constitution is to create a standard set of institutions and laws for the whole country, or a strong federal government, then why not just eliminate the state governments?
You should pose that to the Supreme Court.
I'm posing it to you guys who have made a pretty compelling case that's the purpose of the Constitution. So that,
I mean, I feel like Marshall kind of did that with a lot of the cases, and a lot like, no, I mean, not not all of the cases, and not necessarily like the whole state government, but Marshall pretty much gave the court the power to, like he gave the Supreme Court the power to overturn state Supreme Court.
That's so different than eliminating state government.
I know, but it's like, I think that, I'm not saying, maybe I spoke too soon. I don't think that he like eliminated, like full on eliminated them, but he definitely lowered their significance in comparison to the federal government. I think.
was the purpose of the Constitution to eliminate state governments?
So was that a stretch of the Constitution? Or was that within the bounds of the Constitution?
I don't know. There's
Well, that's a whole question of do we want a powerful federal government that can sort of beat down the states? And I think the Constitution doesn't give a clear answer to that. Because it's not, because it was a document that was created by like half the people
Yeah,
wanted
yeah.
that, half of the people didn't. So they kind of just made something ambiguous.
I was just thinking that, like, if the Constitution was created by people who radically disagreed with each other ideologically, and some people like wanted there were a lot of compromises within the Constitution. How can you strengthen a document that is in itself a compromise? How can you strengthen a compromise? The only way I can think of is through enforcement of the compromise. If you ideologically change the compromise, then are you weakening it?
Well, I think if you strengthen the compromises, then that wouldn't necessarily be what Ethan said of reading it strictly. Because if you read if you continue on the road of this old compromise that's not strong, then you're not going to strengthen it as ideologies shift. So then maybe strengthening the Constitution would be strengthening the compromise, so reading it, so that it's more, so that both sides are more comfortable with it.
I'm going to pose one last question. Have you guys play with this for a minute, see where it goes? Here's another possible definition: the purpose of the Constitution was to create a federal government with clear limitations. We want a stronger federal government. We don't want the states fighting with each other all the time in the Articles of Confederation, so we're going to create a federal government, but with clear limitations. That's the purpose of it.
How would you get clear limitations? Because, I think the people that created the Constitution could totally claim that they had clear limitations and explanations on all of the things that they posed.
They did.
I think-
Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 9.
But, so then, if you were to create a federal government that had clear limitations, people could totally find a way to interpret them differently.
So did Marshall do that? Is that what Marshall did?
I don't know anymore.
Weaken the
I think
limitation.
there was.
I don't
Wait,
know.
can you say that again?
Say
If this, I'm not suggesting this is the purpose of the Constitution. I'm just posing it. There are those who say this, that the purpose of the Constitution was to create a federal government with clear limitations. This is what they're allowed to do, and we need a stronger federal government. We know that, but it also needs to be limited, and so we're going to do that. That's what the Constitution was designed to do.
No, I don't think then that under that definition, I don't think that Marshall abided by the purpose of the Constitution. Because of the way that he, and like this goes back, and I feel like, and I'm sorry if like I've been repeating myself, but I feel like he is stretching the Constitution a lot and creating a lot of, I mean, and it depends how you look at limitations too. I mean, all of these words like have double meaning. Like you could interpret them in many different ways, and limitations could mean like precise, no, Congress shall not, or it could just mean whatever is not written there.
If we're using that definition, then I think Marshall weakened the Constitution. He gave the government more power by weakening the limitations.
Like the government already has a lot of power. The Constitution kind of creates these branches
Right,
of
but you go
government
Marshall.
that sets up limitations to what each of them do.
But that's pretty much right. It's responding to Carly's point. I feel like that's pretty much the same thing as saying not to say it's wrong. It's the same thing as saying just wanted to draw a connection to our earlier part of the conversation, where it's the same thing as saying that he strengthened the federal government in doing so, he strengthened the federal government's power over the Constitution, thereby weakening the Constitution. If we look at it as the Constitution and the federal government sort of in conflict, where the Constitution is sort of it's limiting that federal government.
But if the Constitution is now being enforced through judicial review, doesn't that already make it stronger than it was before?
But it makes the courts stronger than they
But it
were
like
before.
makes it so the Constitution matters. Otherwise, no one would have to follow it.
Why? The voters insist. The voter is.
I mean,
I mean, it's
just
a
like
bad
thinking
idea.
about like voters in this election year, they didn't give a crowd about constitutionality of anything.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So the Supreme Court is. You think the Supreme Court cares more about the Constitution
Than the average
than
American.
the average, or the voters in general?
I would say
Well, a lot of voters voted for the president, and we're still sifting through the data, but they say they voted for the president because of the Supreme Court. Because they wanted to have their kind of justice on the Supreme Court. Whatever that's worth. All right. I'm going to